With me now to Genesis chapter 23. Genesis chapter 23. And I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, well, look, Dennis, isn't it a matter of personal choice? And the answer would be yes, absolutely. You might be saying, well, then it didn't matter whether Jesus was buried or he was cremated and then resurrected. And no, God had a particular plan because he wanted the people who had seen him killed and the people who had been with him during his public ministry and others in the city of Jerusalem to see that this was actually the same Jesus that had been put to death, who was now living again and even carrying the scars of his crucifixion in his body and in his side and so forth. And so, yes, God had one son and God buried his son because it has to do with his plan of salvation. But let's go to Genesis 23, and this is about Sarah. Sarah lived to be 127 years old. She died at Kiriath Arba, that is Hebron, in the land of Canaan. And Abraham went to mourn for Sarah and to weep over her. Boy, they had been through a lot together, hadn't they? I mean, they had a kid at age 100, and they've been through so much. Then Abraham rose from beside his dead wife and spoke to the Hittites. He said, I am an alien and a stranger among you. Sell me some property for burial site so that I can bury my dead. The Hittites replied to Abraham, Sir, listen to us. You are a mighty prince among us. Bury your dead in the choicest of our tombs. None of us will refuse you his tomb for burying your dead wife or burying your dead. Then Abraham rose and bowed down before the people of the land, the Hittites. He said to them, if you're willing to let me bury my dead, then listen to me and intercede with Ephron, the son of Zohar, on my behalf, so he will sell me the cave of Machpelah. He wants a particular burial site. Do you know where you're going to be, if you're going to be buried? Do you know where you're going to be buried? I actually know where I'm going to be buried if I don't change my mind. Fred and I actually are thinking about maybe changing our minds. But we've already bought cemetery plots in the cemetery at the Antioch Church of Christ, where I started out as a little tiny boy with our little young country redneck family. And that was my first church experience in Sunday school and all that. And so I know I kind of like the idea that that's where I'm going to come up out of the ground on that great and final day and just rise in the air. And unless we change our mind and we decide to do it some other place, which again, we're toying with the idea. As we get closer and closer, as we get older, Fredo begins to say, I don't know if that's where I want to, my body to be until Judgment Day or not. But anyway, he's got a particular burial spot in mind for his wife, the cave of Machpelah. And so he's asking that they talk to Ephron about selling him the cave of Machpelah. He said, ask him to sell it to me for a full price as a burial site among you. Notice he wants to pay full price. I have this barber friend who sometimes he'll say, I ought to give you a discount because it doesn't take me long as to cut your hair. And then sometimes he'll say, I ought to charge you more. It takes me longer to find your hair. And I'll always tell him, I don't want any cheap haircuts. I want to pay the same price as the guys who have anyway. Well, Abraham does not want a cheap cut rate discount burial site for his precious wife. He says, whatever the thing is worth, I want to pay it. I don't want you to shave. Don't knock off 10%. I don't want you to put it on sale. I want to pay whatever it's worth because this is how I want to honor my wife. Well, he goes on to say, I will pay the price. This is down verse 12, or the latter part. I will pay the price of the field. Accept it from me so I can bury my dead there. Okay, skipping on down. This is all about the give and take between the Hittites and Abraham, and he just wants to buy a place to bury his wife. And look at verse 19. Afterward, Abraham buried his wife Sarah in the cave in the field of Machpelah near Mamre, which is at Hebron. Now, somebody might read that and say, but hold on, wait a minute, Abraham, that's not Sarah. Her spirit, the real Sarah, is gone, and you're just burying the body in which Sarah inhabited while she was alive for these 127 years. But if you'll notice the way Moses writes this, in Abraham's mind, she's his wife, and he's burying Sarah. I know a person who was so sensitive about his own, the placement of his body after his death, that he chose to be, he said, I want a mausoleum. Now what he wanted was an above ground, it's a singular special, he saved up his money and he paid for it ahead of time. And by the way, which is a very, very nice thing to do, and that is to make arrangements for your own, instead of leaving it to your family, to have to, deal with and decide and all that. I had a cemetery salesman. What do you call them? They sell the cemetery plots. And he told me, this was years ago when I was like 20, in late 20s, I guess, and he was at our house, and he had my wife and me. He was a professional salesman. He says, you need to go ahead and take care of this now, because you don't want to leave it to her. And he pointed to my beautiful brown-eyed wife. He said, you don't want to have to leave it up to her to have to pick out a spot. And he had this thing he was turning, and he had pages of pictures. And here was this poor widow, black and white picture. It was a cold, rainy day. And she was out there in this cemetery, and she was pointing like, well, I guess we can, and to bury her poor husband. He said, you don't want to have to leave it up to your wife to have to pick out a cemetery plot when she can't see the ground for the tears in her eyes. I looked at him and I said, hey, buddy, you are a salesman. You are great. And we didn't buy it because I already knew what I wanted to do. I wanted to be buried in Antioch. And I still do, I think. So this guy, he wanted his above ground. He said, I don't even want to be underground, but he said, I want my body taken care of, and ready for the great and final day. Well, that's one way to look at it, and what about this? Let's go to Genesis chapter 50, I think it is. Yeah, Genesis chapter 50, verse 22. Joseph stayed in Egypt along with all his father's family. He lived 110 years. Imagine the wrinkles he had. And he saw the third generation of Ephraim's children, also the children of Machir, son of Manasseh, were placed at birth on Joseph's knees. Then Joseph said to his brothers, I am about to die, but God will surely come to your aid and take you up out of this land to the land he promised on oath to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Verse 25, and Joseph made the sons of Israel swear an oath and said, God will surely come to your aid, and then you must carry my bones up from this place. So he died, and they embalmed him and placed in a coffin in Egypt, and it goes on to say, but anyway, Joseph didn't want his remains left in Egypt. He says, get me out of here. Now he said, I don't know exactly when the Lord's going to deliver us from this bondage and this slavery, but when he does, take my bones and bury them in the promised land. The Native Americans, they run the gamut as far as attitudes about the remains of a deceased loved one. I'm talking about in the years leading up to the settling of the West and all that, and once people came from Europe and other places and started immigrating to America. For instance, there are some Native American tribes who, when they have a loved one to die, they will take the loved one out into, or they used to, they would take the loved one out into the forest or the wilderness somewhere and maybe have a little ceremony and then leave and just leave the body out there for whatever happens to it. And for the vultures and all this to come. And it was their attitude that this was giving the body back to the earth because, some people think that the Native Americans got a bad deal when the people came to America. But understand this, these people didn't know anything about the one and only Savior of the world. They were worshiping the wind and the fire and the sun and the earth and all this. And I've always just kind of thought that God in His providence caused all this to happen with people being moved from other continents to America so that the gospel could be preached in America and even from America to other places in the world. But anyway, some of them would do that. Others would build these funeral pyres where it was a lot of wood. It was like a stack of wood and leaves and branches and things like that. And then put the body of the deceased up there, and they would dance all around and hoop and howl and set it on fire, and the body would be consumed in the fire and the heat that way. But then there are other Native American Indians that if they even see a skeleton in like an antique store or a museum or something like this, if they believe that it's a skeleton of a Native American, they will create all kinds of protest until those bones, that skeleton, is turned over to them because they want those bones to have a proper and decent burial. They think it's just an abomination for a person's bones to be exposed, stood up on a rod and for people to. So people have different attitudes. That's what I'm saying about the remains of the human body. Well, what does the Bible say? The Bible says in Ecclesiastes 12 verse 7 that when we die, that the dust returns to the dust from which it came. The body returns to the dust, and the spirit returns to God from whence it came. And so, that's what the Bible says about it. But it's a personal choice. There's nothing in the Bible that says that the remains of a human being has to be treated a certain way. Now, we do see the example of the early church and the Jewish culture. They always buried on the same day that the person died. Now, if the person died very near the end of the day, then they would wait until after 6 the next morning. But they never let more than 24 hours go by until they buried the remains of the body. I'm reading a book right now called How Christianity Changed the World. And one of the segments in that book is talking about how that Christianity and all the Jewish tradition leading up to the establishment of the church and the beginning of Christianity, how it elevated the attitude toward the remains, the human remains. In other words, the bodies of the dead, to where great care was given. Now, I do realize that the Egyptians embalmed, at least royalty was embalmed. No one thinks that all Egyptians were embalmed, but royalty, they had these elaborate tombs built and pyramids and things like that, and so they perfected the process of embalming. But anyway, this book says that it seems that Christianity and again the Jewish tradition leading up to the establishment of the church elevated people's attitude toward showing respect and paying respect to the human body. I was in Vietnam back, 10, 12 years ago with a couple of great traveling friends. We were on a mission trip. One of them was T.J. Hughes Allen. And we went by this place that they make and sell urns for the ashes of people who have been cremated. And these were very elaborate urns. As a matter of fact, they were beautiful. And they were all different kinds. And TJ wanted to buy one of these urns. As a matter of fact, he wanted to buy more than one, but he couldn't figure out how to get them back, in his suitcase, didn't have room and all that. And he said, I really would like to collect these. And I'm thinking, you want to collect urns? And he said, yeah. He said, these are beautiful. And he thought it was, and to me, I just couldn't see it, I couldn't see the attraction that he had, but he thought that was just an amazing thing. I do know a man who started collecting cookie jars one time, and it went okay for a while until he filled an entire room. I've been in that room. He lived in Kosciuszko, Mississippi. And pretty soon he was building shelves and then taking in more rooms and more shelves, because he was a traveler, and every time he traveled somewhere, he'd find another beautiful cookie jar, and he didn't have one like that in his collection. You can do that with urns for the ashes of a cremated person as well. And so I lost my train of thought. I had a really great point I was going to make with all that, except I forgot what it was. Oh, I know what it is. I looked up on the internet about the difference between the ratio in America of people who are cremated as compared to those who are buried. And it turns out that every decade in America, more and more people are cremated. And right now, it's almost 50-50. It's actually like 48 to 52. 48% of people in America are cremated. I didn't realize that the ratio was that high, and that is if this article is correct. But then it shows state by state, and guess what? More people in the South choose to be buried. More people in the North choose to be cremated, and so there is that difference there. And then I also looked up the expense, because a normal funeral these days can be very, very expensive, especially if there's a burial involved. My son's mother-in-law passed away. She died of cancer, and she was buried in Columbia, Louisiana, which is just out of Monroe, just south of Monroe, where my son's father-in-law is buried as well. And anyway, he had worked for a funeral home there as a part-timer, the father-in-law had, and so they felt like they had kind of inside connections. And so my son and daughter-in-law just turned it over to their friends at the funeral home, and they said, "You just take care of it, And they said, "Well, you want a nice funeral, right?" "Yeah." "And well, you want a picture in the paper, you want this?" Yeah, no, and they weren't asking, "Well, will this cost something, and how much will this cost?" They ran up a bill. When they got that bill, it floored them. First of all, they couldn't afford it. And secondly, they thought their friends were taking care of them. But their friends were saying, "Hey, you want this? We'll do that. You want this? We'll do that. You want this. And they just added up a huge expenditure for them. And I would have helped them if I'd have known it, but my son is so proud he wouldn't tell me. For years, until years later, he told me, "You got to watch it, because they will run up a huge bill on you if you don't watch every item that you're agreeing to." And when you have a broken heart, when you're grieving, and it's not prepared and it's not prepaid, you can agree to just whatever they say, because you want the very best for your loved one. And so it was extremely expensive. But cremation is about half of what a burial and all is. And so that has to be taken into account. Now somebody says, "Well, is it okay to be cremated?" Well, yes, it is. As a matter of fact, notice what Paul says in 1 Corinthians 13:3. Let's go to this. Let me just turn to that. And he's talking about he said, "I could even give my body to be burned." And I don't know exactly what he means, but I do know that he's saying that I could give my body to be burned and have not love. And so he says, just beginning in verse 1, "If I speak in tongues of men and of angels and have not love, I'm only a resounding gong or a clanging cymbal. If I have the gift of prophecy and can fathom all mysteries and all knowledge, and if I have a faith that can move mountains but have not love, I am nothing. If I give all I possess to the poor and surrender my body to the flames but have not love, I gain nothing." And so Paul is just talking about I think what he's saying there, and he's being a little bit metaphorical, but he's basically saying that wouldn't make any difference. Giving my body to the flames wouldn't make any difference as far as the eternal destiny of my soul. But he says what I'm really talking about is the value of love. Love is the most valuable thing of all, even more valuable than the decision we make about what happens to our bodies when we die. But I was saying all this to see that there are a number of examples, especially in the Old Testament, of people being burned. And then, of course, there are people who are lost at sea and whose bodies are just dissolved in the sea. and will never be reassembled as far as the body is concerned. There are a lot of things that can happen to people, and this is Revelation chapter 20. Revelation 20, and we're looking at verse 13. This is talking about Judgment Day. He says, verse 11, I saw a great white throne and him who was seated on it. Earth and sky fled from his presence, and there was no place for them. And I saw the dead, great and small, standing before the throne, and the books were open. Another book was opened, which is the book of life. The dead were judged according to what they had done as recorded in the books. The sea gave up the dead that were in it, and death and Hades gave up the dead that were in them. And each person was judged according to what he had done. Now, I read you that passage just to remind you that no matter what happens to your body, whether you're buried or where you're cremated or you're lost at sea or you're burned in a house fire or a fiery automobile accident, no, it doesn't matter. God is able to resurrect our bodies, and that's the main thing. So I think it's very, very important for us to understand that. So again, the question is asked, what does the Bible say is the difference between burial and cremation? And the truth of the matter is the Bible doesn't say that one is preferable over the other. And so the Bible leaves it up to us to decide what we are most comfortable with and what we want done with our body and with the bodies of our loved one. Yes, Jesus is a special case because, again, God wanted people to see this very body that had been killed. He wanted the people to see it alive again. And so for that reason, God's Son was buried. If you choose to be cremated, and a lot of people will, and a lot of people plan to, and yes, sometimes because of expense, people feel like that they need to, then I think that's your business and no one else's. It's certainly not any preacher's business. Whatever you decide to do as far as funeral arrangements and things like that, that's a personal matter and should be left that way. Okay, we're going to